Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some active learning techniques. I'm going to present, Joe, and we're going to talk about a few of them. I'm going to ask for some ideas from you about what's worked well for you. And then I'm going to share some resources that might be helpful in suggesting some ideas for active learning. So, um, so first, what is active learning? And it's pretty loosely defined typically, but I think we know it when we see it. And passive learning is what we often see in many classrooms when we walk by them, especially some larger classrooms where there's a professor up at the front of the room and there's students who are sitting there, sometimes taking notes, sometimes scrolling through their iPhones or video feeds, etc. But the key is active learning is when students are actively engaged and thinking about and processing the material. And the active learning activities, if you are doing primarily lecture, they could range from just a few minutes to a whole class period, or even some active learning activities could take place over multiple days and multiple class sessions. First, I'll put this URL in chat. This should take you to a little board where you can suggest some of your favorite active learning activities. The URL is in the chat now. It's a little Padlet.
It's asking me to log in as an authorized user. It said this Padlet is private.
Do you have to? It's private. Oh, that was my mistake. I put it together last night. I'm sorry. Um, this is my fault. You don't have to log in. Let me change that. That should only take just a second. I don't use Padlet that much. I decided sometime late last night to allow that, and apparently it was not a good idea. Okay, it's not on there. It's well, while I'm trying to figure out how to make this public, could anyone just put in chat or any suggestions on what are some of your favorite active learning activities? Well, the other option is maybe it's under share. There we go. Now you should be able to use the board. Okay. Sorry about that, and thank you. So
I'm still getting a note that it's for registered users only, so I need to make an account to access it.
is that true? I mean,
I didn't think so because I've used Padlet before, but
let me try refreshing it, maybe, or if you refresh it, maybe it should be different. Because I did not intend to set it that way. So
Yeah,
visitors with a link should not require anything to join.
I was able to get in
Oh,
without
wait,
joining.
wait, there is the require visitors to log in. Now if you refresh it, it should do it. This is one of those things I should have tested, but been one of those weeks. Now is it working?
yep, it's working now. Thank you.
I figured this was a nice background for as we go. Are you thinking in terms of the academic year? Okay, we've got think, pair, share, and small group discussion activities. those are some of the easiest active learning activities to implement. And if anyone just came in, here's the link to the Padlet, and it's actually working now. Students working on hard problems in pairs at whiteboards. That can be really effective if you have enough whiteboard space to do that.
Or a small enough class.
Or a small enough class, that's true. Parent share, yes. It's an old active learning activity, but it's very effective. Students write 3 questions they thought you would ask on an exam as an external class activity, typeset the questions, distribute them to groups where they taught each other these questions. And you use the ones that were submitted for their exam. Okay, good. Electronic polling is really effective too. 5-minute exit tickets, also sometimes called 1-minute quizzes or 1-minute reflections. Both of those are part of the classroom assessment techniques, where a new volume of that came out just this past year after about a 30-year lag between since the second edition. And the third edition of that book on classroom assessment techniques now includes activities involving AI as well. And there are dozens, maybe even hundreds of classroom assessment activities that do take between 1 and 5 minutes. Scavenger hunt-like exercises where people do some quick research, connect it with other groups to put information data together to solve a problem. Excellent. Well, those are all good suggestions, and we'll look at some others coming up shortly. Any other thoughts? Everyone have that? If you keep the link to that, you'll have a link to these things. Okay, so let's move on. And there we go. So why should we use active learning? And one of the most major reasons is that it tends to lead to deeper learning, less superficial learning. This was a term that was used a lot by Ken Bain. But basically, what's meant by that is that you've got some long-term knowledge retention, and you also develop more ability to transfer things that you've learned into other formats. And it can be really helpful. And the more processing you do with the information by active learning activities, again, the more likely you're going to integrate it into your store of knowledge or your into your cognitive map of how the world works. So we get longer term recall, improved transferability, as I just said. Another interesting thing is that most studies that have looked at the effect with either randomized controlled experiments or multiple sections of a course where some students were in a quasi-random arrangement, where some students were in active learning sections and some were in more traditional lecture settings. Pretty much every one of those studies have found that students in the active learning sections learn more, but also in pretty much every study that I've seen, they also reduce the equity gap. And it's partly because, the students who are most at risk are actively engaged with other students typically during this period. And they're learning from each other, they're sharing knowledge. And it's, I'm not sure of the exact mechanism, but again, it's been shown to be really effective. An interesting set of studies was done at Cornell when they introduced their active learning initiative. And in the economics department in particular, they found that the racial and the Pell eligibility gap in student learning outcomes either completely or nearly completely disappeared after active learning was introduced in sections of courses compared to past semesters before they introduced those active learning activities. So it tends to benefit all students, but the students who benefit the most are those who are typically or more likely to be left behind. So it's really good in terms of equity as well as just improved learning in general. One of the issues that many students have is that when you're sitting in a lecture, it all makes sense, especially if the person presenting is very good at presenting. And what happens is you're sitting there, it seems to make sense, it all fits together really nicely. And the first time when you get exposed to a recognition that you don't understand things quite as nicely as you thought is when you're given a homework assignment to do or when you're given a test. And the nice thing about active learning activities is that it tends to reveal fairly quickly whether students have really understood what they were learning about. And that understanding is both for the instructor when they start talking about what they found in these activities, but also for the students themselves, because they get fairly quick feedback on how well they're understanding things when they're working with other students who are trying to solve problems using the concepts that they've just learned. And that metacognition is helpful so that students get a better sense of how well they understand things. And metacognition is a skill that can be improved with more practice. And again, the more students reflect on their learning, the more deeply they tend to learn. So metacognitive exercises in many studies have also been shown to increase learning. So if you're doing a lecture, a simple thing you can do, if this is a face-to-face or synchronous instruction, is do, as showed up on the Padlet, think, pair, share activities. Polling is another really good activity you can do. And for the last 22 years, one of the most common ways of polling was a technique, or one of the most commonly recommended way of engaging in polling was a technique that Eric Missouri and accidentally discovered about 22, maybe even 23 years ago in his physics class at Harvard, a gen ed physics course. What happened was he had been using polling and he was getting frustrated because students weren't necessarily doing that well on these polls. And he kept trying to explain things in different ways. He'd give them polling questions, and they just had trouble answering them, or they just weren't coming up with the correct answers. So what he did in frustration is he said, "Look, I've tried to explain this to you in a number of different ways, and it doesn't seem to be working. Why don't you try explaining it to each other?" And then they voted again, and it converged to a much larger proportion of the class getting the correct answer. So what he did basically with polling is he introduced something very similar to think, pair, share, where you give students a question which is relatively challenging. He suggests that somewhere around 50 to 60% on average of the class should get it correct. And then you have students talk without revealing a correct answer. You have students talk to each other, try to find someone with a different answer, and then debate it. And find someone who shows a different answer and try to convince them that your answer is better, and then listen to their explanation of why they think their answer was better, and then voting again. And that has been shown to have a really substantial effect. In studies done in physics and chemistry, there's been found with again a similar type of pseudo random controlled experiment where you had students in different sections of the course, some exposed to this technique and some that were not. The learning gains on concept tests that have been pretty commonly adopted in chemistry and physics were between an improvement in the gain from the pre-test and the post-test of between 200% in a study that Carl Wyman and others did in chemistry, and 300% in a study that Eric Mazur and others had done in physics. So it leads to fairly significant learning gains. And what's happening is students are actively processing the material. Mistakes or errors or misunderstanding shows up in all those discussions. And having peers explain things to each other can be really helpful because for a couple of reasons. One is if you know the answer, when you're explaining it to someone else who doesn't get it, it forces you to think about it in terms that you might not have thought about it and reinforces that learning. And for the students who don't understand it quite as well, hearing it from someone at a similar level of cognitive development in the discipline can be more effective than hearing it from instructors who may not always be able to express it in terms that make as much sense to people who are just learning it. Another strategy that often has been shown to be fairly effective in lecture type classes is something called a memory dump, where you just stop at some point and have students write down everything they can recall about what was just discussed. And a good way of building on that is to have them compare notes with the people around you, and they can fill in some of the gaps by doing that. And it encourages students perhaps to pay a little closer attention, but also they get to see things that they hadn't noticed in the discussion. And it reminds them that perhaps they do need to maintain a little bit more focus. But it's also a form of retrieval practice. And all studies pretty much have shown that retrieval practice, practicing retrieving information, is very useful in reinforcing learning and reinforcing your ability to recall things. Basically, the more you practice retrieving information, the better you are at retrieving information. Collaborative note taking is another related strategy where students, either in groups or sometimes if the class is smaller, the whole class will be working in a Google Drive document, for example, and they'll all be taking notes and adding to notes and modifying and correcting it and so forth. That's not a bad strategy. Or if it's a small group, you could have it in groups of 3 or 4 or 5. One type of active learning, well, we talked about a lecture. In a flipped classroom, one strategy that can be really effective is giving pre-class quizzes, because one of the problems with a flipped classroom environment where students learn the basic concepts outside of class, at least in theory, is that students don't always do the reading or watch the videos. But if you are going to do a flipped classroom, giving students some pre-class quizzes can be really effective. And just as a bit of a formative assessment. More extensive use of polling, where students are being tested on what they were supposed to learn before they came into class, can be helpful, especially if combined with that think, pair, share, or that two-stage polling process. Group work on problem sets can also be really effective, and there's a lot of ways you can do that. You could have persistent groups, you could do team-based learning, or you could have just short-term groups where groups are formed on a more temporary basis. But having students work together is really effective because they're sharing the knowledge, they're filling in gaps, and so forth. And group work on problem sets. Another type of thing that can be really useful, typically in smaller classes, is some type of role-playing activity, which can be really fun, but it also can really enhance learning. And there's a lot of resources out there, and I'll share some of those later. But it could have people taking on different roles in some type of debate. It could have people reenacting a historical event of some type relevant to the discipline. And students tend to often get very deeply engaged in that type of activity. Again, if it fits with the learning objectives you're trying to develop. Classroom debates can be also effective, especially if you do it in a way so that everyone gets involved rather than passively observes a small number of people debating. There may be some games and, game-based learning that you could do to enhance learning. Games, by the way, are designed in ways that tend to maximize learning and incentive and motivation. One of the things you observe if you watch anyone playing games is that the games are designed to keep you interested. They're designed to teach you things, but teach you things in a way where you're curious about how to get to the next level. And they can be really good at essentially designing things in a way that keeps you working towards a goal. If we could build more of that into our learning, that might not be a bad thing. And some people have gamified their classes, and there's a lot of ways in which that could be done. Another approach, which has been really effective, is two-stage exams. This has been used quite a bit in physics, but it's being used in more and more disciplines. I've been doing that. I returned to that after taking a few years off from in-class exams in my econometric class this spring. And in a two-stage exam, what happens is students take an exam individually. And if you have a long enough class period, they take the exam first, maybe the first 2/3 of the time, alone, and then they take it again, but in a small group. And what happens there is instead of spending time going over the test with students where they're sitting there either really happy because they did well or really upset and disappointed because they didn't do so well, they're all actively engaged in going through the exam to see what they got right, what they got wrong, but also correcting their knowledge and having their peers discuss it. Having peers discuss it is really effective, and it's a remarkable experience seeing them laughing and joking and about some of the mistakes they made. And the first time I did it, I was amazed by how students were. I heard one student say, for example, I don't remember us discussing this. When did we ever learn this? And then another student said, well, remember when we were working on problems involving heteroscedasticity in this particular data set? We worked through exactly this sort of problems. And then the other student said, oh, yeah, I had forgotten, so on. And it was just so much more positive than going through an exam after they get it back. Because here they don't know how they did. But so they're very curious. They want to know how well they did, and they're actively engaged. It's fresh in their mind, and they're getting some immediate feedback from the peers as they're going through it. And then typically what you do is you assign some sort of a weighted average of the individual score and the group score. It could be something like three quarters, 75%, 25%. Some people do 90-10. Some people even do 2/3 and 1/3. The heaviest weight is on the individual score, but by putting some weight on the group score, it again keeps everybody more actively engaged in that second stage process. And it's so much better grading. It's so much more enjoyable grading the second stage. And it does seem to have a pretty significant effect on learning. There's a lot of other types of projects you can do. There's project-based learning where you take on sometimes typically as a class, but sometimes in small groups, some projects where students are able to take the course learning objectives and apply them in some meaningful way, some form of authentic assignment that is intrinsically valuable. Community-based projects can do that if it's relevant to your class. Classes in the past have done things like done work with businesses to help improve their success, or created marketing campaigns, or developed websites for nonprofits in the community. There have been groups that have gone in and worked with patients in nursing homes, and in some cases did oral histories with them and so forth. But something where you're creating something that's valuable to the community, has some intrinsic value, which again is useful in motivation. Open pedagogy projects are ones in which students are not just passively observing some knowledge, but they're creating some knowledge that can be shared publicly. And the public aspect of an open pedagogy project is really valuable because students know that what they're creating is going to be shared with the public. I've had students create either books or podcast series in my capstone course. I also had them create podcast series in an introductory online class in economics. And they really value the fact that they had something that they could share with their friends, with their parents, and so forth. And also something they could share with potential employers, showing the type of work that they were capable of doing. Among the open pedagogy projects is collections. The Fashion Institute of Technology has a wonderful website where every semester, students will create a collection of fashion from a particular genre, or year, or country, and so forth. And where they post images, they post a history of it and analysis of it, and so forth. Others have done things with local historical sites, and there's any number of things where you can collect resources and post them. Jessamine Newhouse had a project in Plattsburgh before she moved to Syracuse, which was called Picturing Plattsburgh, where she had students taking photos of the community and of the campus actually, and providing some description of it that would go in the archives of SUNY Plattsburgh. So they were creating something that would live beyond their time at the institution. Video projects. I've had students even in my large class create videos as an alternative to exams. And I had weekly exams in the class, and I let them replace 2 of the 14 exam grades with videos that would reflect the same learning objectives in some way. Some of them created a documentary, some of them did a simulation, some of them created narrated PowerPoint slides. Others created a little videos vignette that captured the concept, and some of those were quite clever. Some of them wrote songs that illustrated the concept and performed them. And the rest of the class appreciated seeing some of those as well. They could be text things that are shared publicly. It could be websites or something similar. They could be podcasts. Student presentations are another form of active learning. And there's a number of ways of doing that. You could do it, with one presentation after another, which gets really tedious, but you could also do things like a poster session, or you could do a gallery walk or something similar. Okay, so this is a really quick overview of some ways of introducing this, but what I encourage you to do, I'll put this link right in chat. I put together a whole collection, a collection of some really useful resources that have some really good suggestions for active learning activities. And we'll hop over there in just a second. Either scan that picture with your phone, type in the URL, or click on the link in the chat. And let's go there. And here it's broken into a number of categories. One category is just some of the research, just explaining what the impact of these types of active learning is. And the research is overwhelmingly positive. There have been a few studies recently, or a few critiques of active learning analysis, mostly on the grounds that not all of these projects have been as well designed as research projects could be or should be, perhaps. However, in these large meta-analyses of hundreds of different studies, the results are remarkably positive. So even if some of the studies were not done in a perfect way, or sometimes economic education research is not always done by experts in statistical processes and so forth, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming that active learning is effective. And what I recommend is looking primarily at some of these. There's a few books in there which are really good, but Cornell University has a really nice list of resources on active learning. But my favorite resource here, and if you'd like to look at some active learning activities, is the Kane Patricia Cross Academy, which apparently has changed its address. Let's find it. It hasn't gone away. It just moved to .ua address. Oh, it's moved to the University of Alabama. Okay, this was put together by 2 of Kate Patricia Cross's co-authors on some earlier books. And it's got a nice video library illustrating the techniques, describing how it's done. It's got there's a whole series of things in there, but let's look at the techniques video library for just a second. And here it's sorted in a number of ways. You can filter the techniques by the type of environment, whether it's online, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's HyFlex, etc. You can filter it by the type of activity that's involved, what type of active learning activity is. You could filter it by the type of teaching problem addressed, like disengagement or unprepared students or something similar. Or you can do it by learning taxonomy dimension, which would include things like a foundational knowledge for lower level skills, some application, so you've got roughly Bloom's taxonomy types of things. So you can do it in a number of ways. And now they've included some caring resources to help improve things like a sense of belonging and so on. And they also have more resources now on learning how to learn to help students develop more skills. That wasn't there the last time I looked at this. So, and is there any, let's go back to the techniques and let's do it by the teaching problem addressed. What would be one of those problems you'd like to take a look at? Anyone, just put it in chat or open your mic. think we've probably all seen some issues with cheating, insufficient class preparation, lack of participation, low motivation engagement, poor attention or listening, surface learning, or poor note taking. All of the above, yeah, they all work. Okay, Paul did say disengagement, so let's do that because we've seen a lot of discussions of low motivation and engagement. Okay, so here's some things that they suggest. One is a digital story where students will create a digital video story, basically, where students are telling personal academic stories about life experiences relevant to course themes. That brings in different senses of identity. It brings in a nice and diverse environment where students get to share their individual experiences, which they tend to enjoy doing. And the nice thing is you can go here and if you choose to do this, you can view the technique where there's a little video. We won't watch the video now, but the videos are like 2 to 5 minutes describing how it's done. And then they have an instructor's guide. And in the instructor's guide, let's download that. It's a nice little zip file. It has all the materials you would use to build that in. And let me go over to here. Well, let me got to minimize this to get it over here. Okay, here is the so there's a template that you could use for it, which is on another screen. Okay, I'll bring that one over. So this tells you here, this is how you would implement it. You fill in the blank, and then you would go to the instructor's guide to assist how to do this. And this is to build in a bit of a transparency in learning and teaching. What's the learning task, underlying problems and prompts? So this is tying it to good course design and so forth. But let's see what else there is there. Here's an updated one from 2021. Here's a rubric, a sample rubric on how you can evaluate it based on AACNU, Oral Communication Values Rubric. And so you got a basic rubric you can start with. If you don't like it, you can always modify it, but it's a good starting point. And there's a whole lot of material there. And what else? Okay, well, let's go back to the website. Basically, for all of the activities, it gives you the information that you need to be able to implement them, as well as some of the materials that you just have to modify a little bit and share directly with students. And then here's how you could do it for online teaching, modification for that. And let's see what else they got. So that's just one way of doing it. The 3-2-1 technique is something that's become pretty popular the last 5 or 6 years, where students typically at the end of the class, you ask them to list 3 things they learned from the class, 2 things they found interesting, and 1 question they still have, which is very similar to the type of things that we use with classroom assessment techniques like the 1-minute quiz or the 5-minute quiz, et cetera. And one of the nice things, though, about asking them to list 3 things about what they learned in the lecture is that it forces them to go back and recall that. So there's a little bit of retrieval practice built into it. And it reminds them that there were some things that they learned. And there have been a number of studies, in particular in economics, there was one that found a fairly significant effect just from introducing a 1-minute quiz, asking students what they understood and what they were confused by. This just puts in a few more of those steps. And then here's an instructor's guide. You could watch a video showing the technique. Here, this can be really effective. It's a nice form of authentic assessment where you have students connect things that they're seeing in the world with things that are related to their coursework. And I think we can all find some connections between what we're teaching about and things in the world. If not, we may want to reconsider what we're teaching. Although I suppose there's some cases it may be harder than others. The jigsaw technique is a really popular active learning activity where you break up a task into some components. You have students, if you have, say, 4 topics and you have, let's say, 20 students. You could break them up into 5 groups. Each person in the group is assigned to one of the topics. You have all the students who are working on the first topic from across the groups get together and come up with a way of explaining it to each other. Then they go back to their groups and they explain it to their group. And then you can check the groups to see how well everyone understands it. And that has been shown to be fairly effective. So they basically take what they've learned and explain it to others. And they tend to do really well on the things they're explaining to others, maybe not as well on the other concepts. But if they're all applications of a similar concept, it does work really nicely. Team Jeopardy is, I think, something we can see how that might work very well. It's just kind of fun. 3-minute messages, a 3-minute thesis, academic competition. They have 3 minutes to come up with a compelling argument and support it with details and examples. Examining your personal learning environments, how you may want to form these types of connections to remind people that we're going to be learning for the rest of our lives. Working in groups to prepare for a test. Students won't always do that, but it's something I always encourage them to do. And some of the best outcomes I've had in my large economics class is when I see some of those groups meeting together in the library. There was one time there were 3 or 4 groups that were meeting 2 or 3 times a week here. And if they got stuck on something, they'd send sometimes one person, sometimes a whole group would come down to my office and ask some questions. And those groups did really, really well. But encouraging them to do this or creating these teams explicitly can be really helpful. It helps build community, it helps build connections among the students, and that's also important for retention and student success. Role-playing activity and so forth. There's a whole lot of things in here. And then that's just the first page, and there's more. So if you are getting stuck on something, take a look through these, watch the little videos and see if it might be useful in your class. Let's see. Well, let's do cheating. This is something fairly new too. And okay, here you take some sort of an altered version, and this is something that may be a little bit less amenable to AI, where students can somehow modify some original item, coming up with an alternative ending of the story, although AI can do all these things. It may be easier for them just to try doing it on their own. AI is really good at answering questions, but it may not be necessarily quite as good as imagining the consequences of a change event in history, maybe. Here, students start with sentence stems, and then they create the content from this. They complete the sentences within a clear and organized framework, inventing the quiz, quotation summaries, creating crib cards. Okay, so just having little note cards where students create to use on exams. I've done this in some of my classes, especially those where there's a lot of formulas, and just tell them that they can bring in a certain number or as many 3x5 cards as they want. Or if you really want to get them to focus their efforts on doing it, give them a single 3x5 note card, and where they can put in those concepts that are most important. In the process of them thinking about what concepts are most important can be a useful learning experience as well. Okay, so there's a lot in here, and I really strongly suggest that you look through this. And the cross currents library is where, there's articles now, okay, on how we can rethinking class assessment. This is something that is being expanded all the time. Claire Major has been working on this for a few years now. And Kate Patricia Cross, by the way, was one of the people who came up with the classroom assessment technique. So this is in her honor, and basically. And is being funded by one of the books that Clara Major and her partner with this process put together on applying all these things. So they're taking all the profits from the book on active learning techniques and using it to fund the video creation, the hosting, and other resources that are growing. Every time I look at it, there's a bit more, and it even changed address. I guess they decided to do it under the University of Alabama rather than paying for their own domain name to save them a little bit of money, perhaps. And maybe they're getting some support from the university. That I don't know. Um, and then there's the skill series, which again is a new division here. Okay. This is actually some skills mostly for faculty in terms of being more effective as teachers. How can you engage students? How can you support a community of students, et cetera? So there's a lot of good stuff in here. And that's just one of the resources on here. Let's see. Oh, and another one, I mentioned role playing. A really great resource for role playing is reacting to the past. Um, I'm not authorized to access this page. Oh no. Well, apparently the link changed, but it's still here. Okay. So reacting to the past are a series of structured games that have been around for a while now. And they have games in many, many disciplines where they're basically prepackaged things with different roles shared among the students. And some of them last for an hour, some of them can last for weeks. We had someone here in the bio department, was it bio? Might have been astronomy actually, who was doing this. I don't remember if he was doing it in astronomy or if that was just the example he chose. But the example he played, where a group of faculty worked on this for several weeks just to see what the reacting to the past process was like, he was reacting to the past episode that involved the discussions over whether Pluto should be a planet. Um, and people played different roles, advocating for it, opposed to it, and so forth. And there's all sorts of historical simulations and political simulations and other things there where people take on a role and they research the role and then they interact as if they're in that position. And it was interesting to watch it develop. And I think you can pay for some of this, but there's also a lot of free ones out there. There used to be a lot more in here, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Well, yeah, it looks like these are now mostly behind a wall. My guess is, though, if it's very similar to the past, it was free, and I'm hoping it still is free. But you may have to sign up to become part of the community. And maybe some of this was put behind this logging wall because of some of the restrictions that we're seeing being imposed on higher ed in various states and so on. So, because some of them did deal with issues of inclusion and slavery and all those things that have fallen out of favor in some states. So, oh, sorry about that. They were there when I last clicked on this a few months ago, but they are not now. So I will have to update that. But there's a lot of other resources, including a lot of podcasts. Coincidentally, Tim Franz and Lauren Vicker were at the University of were at RIT, I believe it was, and they have a couple of books out now on small group activities and best practices in doing that. Here's a podcast with a couple of people from Empire State on teaching digital storytelling. Clara Howell Major, one of the developers of this site, talks about her book, Engaging Teaching. And then Teaching for Learning is another good book on these. And one of these had originally 100 active learning techniques. But then during COVID, they doubled the number. So they had over 200 active learning techniques because they were originally done for the classroom. And then they expanded to online and high flex and hybrid types of instruction. So, and one of the things though, I think there may be a slide on this, is student resistance. And that's probably, is there a slide on it? Well, here's a slide, but one of the issues with, with active learning is that while active learning increases learning, students often do not feel that it does. And a classic study, it's listed in that list of resources by there's Laurie's and I forgot who else. But basically what they looked at was classes where some sections were using active learning and others were not, but they had standardized exams in the STEM fields. And what they found is on average, students who were in STEM fields that used active learning learn more. They did better on the common final exam in those classes than students who were in lecture classes. But the same students, when they were asked to rate how effective the learning was in that class, rated, or the students who were in the lecture class thought the lectures were much more effective, or students in general felt lectures were more effective than active learning activities. So if you are going to build a large share of your course with active learning, it's really important that you sell that to students. Explain to them why active learning is useful. Show them some of the research, show them some of the meta-analyses, and explain that, you learn by making mistakes. If you're sitting in a lecture class and you're just passively listening, you're not learning from making mistakes. The time when you make mistakes are when you're taking higher stakes graded assessments. It's much better to learn from mistakes when there's either no cost or very little cost. So that way, by the time you get to the higher stakes assessments, you master the material more deeply. Now, one challenge is that with AI, all these tools no longer work quite as well. What many of these tools and approaches don't work quite as well. In particular, I talked a little bit before about polling and that two-stage process. One of the things that happens is when you use polling, the questions will typically either show up on the screen, or at the very least, they're at the projector at the front of the room. All students need to do is take a picture of that or a screenshot and ask one of the AI tools on their device to give them the answer, and it will generally give them the correct answer. And in large classes, it's also common for students to come up with some type of a chat group in the class, and to be sharing answers back and forth. And one of the things I've discovered is that with types of questions where typically before 50 to 70% of the class would get it correct when I'd ask it the first time, and then it would go up by 10 to 30% on the second time after they discuss it. Typically, 85 to 92% or so of the students will answer it correctly the first time. Now, I suppose it's possible that they are just learning so much more effectively today because of all these other resources they have, but it's probably more likely that they are using AI to answer some of these things and bypassing that whole process of the think, pair, share, and the discussion. And that's a bit of a challenge. So we are going to have to, well, we all have to be experimenting with other ways to assess student learning and also to encourage that learning still take place in a world in which it's really easy to do pretty much all traditional assessments using AI. So, okay, so that's what I've got. Any questions or comments or suggestions on other active learning techniques or other approaches? Oh, and there's a copy of the slides, by the way. I'll put that in the chat.
John, could you say more about the logistics of the two-stage exams?
Okay, yeah, the way I do it, because the class I do it in most often is a 50-minute class. What I do is I give them the exam the first day, and then instead of giving it back the next class meeting, I either take a subset of the questions, or I've already graded the first set, so I know where they're having trouble. And if most students are getting questions correct, there's no sense in asking it. But if if the exam is fairly challenging, and typically in a class it tends to be, you could either give them exactly the same questions or questions that are equivalent on the next version. So basically, you're giving them a second chance at either answering the same questions or something which is isomorphic, something that's equivalent to those questions. And then you grade that as you, well, what will happen is as the group turns in their answers, I'm sorry, once everyone in the group turns in their answer, once the group turns in their answers in the second stage, I hand back their first stage exam so they can see how they did, and then I give them back the second stage the next class meeting. But typically, what will happen is I'll use a whole class period for the first stage, and then I'll use maybe 20 minutes or so of the second for the second stage exam, because as a group, they're able to answer these things much more quickly.
And so, how big are the groups, and do they choose them once they
Typically, the
find
groups
them?
are typically 3 or 4,
Okay.
because I want to keep it small enough so that they're all actively engaged in the discussion.
And do they all submit a separate second copy or one for the
No,
group?
I have one submitted for the group, but I do allow them to dissent if the group cannot agree on a response. And then I will grade that student separately. But that's never happened. The only issue that sometimes has happened, I've done this many times now, but only twice, I've had a student do less well on the group exam than they had individually. And in each case, I told them that, if they really think they're right, they should be more assertive in defending their arguments, because they were really strong students. And, I could have graded them down on the second stage because they gave in to the group, but usually I let them keep their initial score on the second. Well, if they if say they scored a 95 the first time and then they got a 90 or an 85 the second time, I'll usually let them keep their higher score. But that's only happened twice. Almost all the time for all the groups, the group score is going to be higher than the individual score. I do the same thing on the final exam, but it's all done in the same class period, because it's one of 3 exams given in the class, which are normally given in a 50-minute period. I give them, let's say, 45 or 50 minutes for the first exam, for the first stage, and then they form into groups and they take the second stage that very day. And again, the results are very similar.
And have you ever had issues with just one student basically writing all the answers and the other students just know, oh, this is a top student, so we're not going to participate?
Generally not, and partly because they don't always necessarily know that,
Mm.
but it is a possibility. And what I do though is I try to spread them out. What I to informing the groups, and the groups do work together throughout the semester on other group problem sets. What I do at the beginning of class, this is in an econometrics class, which relies on statistics and math and so on. I'll ask them how many prior math courses and statistics related courses have they had in the past. And then I'll sort it from high to low, and then I'll spread all the people out who've had the most courses across the groups. So each group will have someone who has a relatively strong background and someone with a relatively weak background, so that the groups are fairly balanced that way. But I do wander around and I listen to the discussions, and they all, pretty much all of them, tend to be actively engaged. There's only been 1 or 2 students this past semester who sat there fairly quietly, and they were students who had missed a lot of classes. So I think they felt, that they couldn't contribute very much. But in general, they all did tend to discuss these things, and it's been a really positive experience for me.
Thank you. That's great.
In fact, the first time I did it, we had talked about this on a podcast with one of the people who had developed this, and I decided to try it. And listening to the groups, the volume of discussion was so remarkable while they're taking a test. Uh, I took a short video clip of it and sent it to Rebecca so she could see how this thing was working in practice, and it was a lot of fun. And the students really enjoy it too.
Thank you.
Any other suggestions or questions or suggestions for active learning activities? the most useful thing here, I think, are some of the resources that are in that document. So take a look through them and see if there's anything of interest. Okay, well, it's good to see everyone. I'll stop the recording.